There was nothing dramatic about the first sign that something was wrong with Jady Cristine Pereira Rosa. No emergency call from her. No public search. No desperate appeal asking where she had gone. She simply did not show up for work. And sometimes the smallest break in someone's routine is the first warning that something terrible has happened. Jady lived in Limerick City. She was originally from Sorocaba in Sao Paulo, Brazil, but Ireland had become an important part of her life. She had lived in Limerick for several years. She worked there. She had friends there. She had built a routine there. And according to reporting from Limerick, that routine was exactly what caused people to realize something was wrong. Jady worked with a cleaning company. Friends would regularly meet her in the morning so they could travel to work together. It was something ordinary, something repeated, something nobody would normally think twice about. But on Friday, the 21st of August, 2026, Jady was not there. They waited, and Jady did not arrive. Maybe at first there was a simple explanation. Maybe she had slept late. Maybe she was unwell. Maybe her phone was somewhere she could not hear it. But as time passed, concern grew, because the people waiting for her knew her. They knew her routine, and something about that morning was wrong. Eventually, the concern became serious enough that guards were alerted. At approximately 7:30 that morning, emergency services were called to Carlton House on Cecil Street in Limerick City. Behind the door of Jady's apartment, they found her unresponsive. She was pronounced dead at the scene. And in that moment, the question changed. It was no longer, why did Jady not come to work? It became, what happened to Jady inside her own apartment? The building suddenly became the center of an investigation. A section of the area was sealed off. Detectives arrived. Members of the Garda Technical Bureau began examining the scene. Jady's apartment was preserved, so specialists could search for anything that could explain what had happened. Anything disturbed. Anything left behind. Anything that could help investigators reconstruct her final hours. Outside, life in Limerick continued. People walked through Cecil Street. Cars passed. Businesses opened. Workers started their Friday morning. But inside Carlton House, investigators were beginning to examine the death of a woman who, only hours earlier, had simply been expected to turn up for work. And that is what makes the beginning of this case so unsettling. There was apparently no long period in which Jady was missing. Her friends noticed quickly. Her absence mattered because it was unusual. And within a relatively short period of time, they had gone from wondering why she was late to learning that she was dead. Jady's body was removed from the apartment and taken to the mortuary at University Hospital Limerick. At that stage, one examination would determine what direction the investigation took next. A post-mortem was carried out by the state pathologist. Investigators waited for the findings. And then, on Saturday, the case changed completely. Guards announced that they were treating Jady's death as murder. That was the moment this stopped being simply an investigation into an unexplained death. Someone had died inside her home. And guards now believed that a criminal act was responsible. But they did not tell the public everything they had discovered. The results of the post-mortem were not released. Gards said those details were being withheld for operational reasons. That is important, because it tells us that investigators now possess information about Jady's death that they believe should remain confidential while the investigation continues. There has been reporting about how Jady may have been injured, but the official post-mortem findings have not been publicly released. So we are not going to speculate about details the investigators themselves have chosen not to disclose. What has been confirmed is serious enough. A murder investigation has been opened. A senior investigating officer has been appointed. An incident room has been established at Henry Street Garda Station. A family liaison officer has been assigned to Jady's relatives. The scene has undergone technical examination. Investigators have been speaking with people connected to the apartment complex, and surveillance coverage from the building and surrounding area has reportedly been examined. But perhaps the most important sentence released by Gards was one of the shortest. They said investigators were following a line of inquiry. Think about what that means. They have not publicly explained that line. They have not told us exactly what evidence led them toward it. But this is no longer simply a case of investigators entering an apartment and asking completely open questions. There is a direction. There is something they are examining. There is something they believe deserves particular attention. Irish reporting has also stated that Gards were seeking to speak with a man known to Jady in connection with the investigation. That fact must be treated carefully. Wanting to speak with somebody does not establish that person's guilt. At the time of this recording, no charge has been publicly announced in connection with Jady's death. No person should be treated as responsible unless and until the evidence establishes that. But it does tell us how active this investigation has become. Within a very short period of time, investigators went from the discovery of Jady's body to a post-mortem, to declaring a murder investigation, to publicly stating that they were following a line of inquiry. And while detectives work through evidence in Limerick, Jady's family has been trying to understand what happened from thousands of kilometers away. Her family remains connected to Brazil. Her brother has spoken publicly about the shock of losing her. He described Jady as someone who helped the people she loved back home, someone who worked to make her mother happy, someone whose life in Ireland represented the dream of building a future in Europe. Then suddenly, that life ended inside the home she had made in Limerick. A fundraiser has now been organized to help with the costs of bringing Jady home to Brazil and arranging her funeral. That is another detail that makes the reality of this case difficult to ignore. A few days earlier, Jady's family had a daughter, a sister, a relative living and working in Ireland. Now they are trying to bring her body home. And somewhere between those two realities is a period of time investigators are trying desperately to reconstruct. Jady's final hours. That timeline could become one of the most important parts of this entire investigation. When was she last seen alive? Who was the last person known to have spoken with her? What was happening around Carlton House before she was found? Did anyone hear something unusual? Did anyone see somebody entering or leaving the building? Did nearby cameras capture movements that appeared meaningless at the time but became important once Jady was found? Because murder investigations can sometimes turn on details that originally looked completely ordinary. A person walking down a hallway. A vehicle stopping for a few minutes. A door opening. A message sent. A phone call that lasted only seconds. A neighbor hearing something and assuming it was nothing. Until later, until investigators established that those minutes were part of someone's final hours. And that is why the surveillance around Carlton House matters. It is why detectives speak to residents. It is why they examine movements around the building. It is why they preserve a scene for so long. They are not simply asking what happened. They are trying to determine exactly when it happened. Then they can begin working backwards and forwards from that point. Who was nearby before it? Who was nearby after it? Who had contact with Jady? Who knew her routine? Who knew where she lived? Who knew she would normally leave for work early in the morning? And was there anything unusual in the hours before she was supposed to meet her friends? Those are questions investigators will have to answer with evidence. Not theories. Not rumors. Evidence. And right now, the public only has a small portion of that evidence, we know where Jady was found. Inside her apartment at Carlton House on Cecil Street. We know when emergency services were called. Around 7:30 on Friday morning. We know why friends became concerned. She had not met them as expected before work. We know a post-mortem was carried out. We know the results had not been publicly released. We know guards are treating her death as murder. And we know they say they are following a line of inquiry. Everything beyond those confirmed facts has to be handled with extreme caution. Because in the early days of a murder investigation, rumors can spread much faster than evidence. People begin filling the gaps themselves. They look at relationships. They look at neighbors. They look at anyone police speak to. And suddenly, suspicion becomes accusation. But that is not how this case should be examined. The most important thing right now is the timeline. Because the timeline cannot lie. At some point before 7:30 on Friday morning, something happened inside or around Jady's apartment. By the time concern was raised, it was already too late. Her friends could not have known that when they first realized she had not arrived. Imagine that moment. You are standing somewhere waiting for someone you meet regularly. You check the time. You wait another few minutes. You send a message. Maybe you call. Nothing. At first it is inconvenient. Then unusual. Then worrying. And eventually you understand that this is not simply someone running late. That ordinary routine may have been one of the reasons Jady was found so quickly. Because people noticed. They cared enough to question her absence. They did not simply assume she had changed her plans. And now those same people are left knowing that the morning they were supposed to travel to work together became the morning their friend was found dead. There's another disturbing element to the story. Jady was found inside her home. That means from the outside there may have been very little to indicate that anything was wrong. The building still stood there. The street still looked normal. Morning still came. People still went to work. But behind one apartment door, a life had ended. And until Jady failed to follow her routine, nobody outside necessarily had a reason to know. That is why investigators now have to reconstruct a period of time that Jady herself can no longer explain. Her phone may tell part of the story. Surveillance footage may tell another part. Witnesses may provide another. Forensic evidence from the apartment may provide another. And each piece needs to match. Because eventually investigators have to create one complete sequence. Jady alive. Jady's final known contact. What happened inside the apartment. The person or people who were present. And what happened immediately afterward. If one part of that sequence does not fit, investigators have to understand why. That is how a timeline becomes more than a collection of times. It becomes a way of testing someone's story against reality. And right now, somewhere inside the evidence collected from Carlton House, detectives will be looking for those fixed points. Things they can prove happened. Things nobody can change afterward. A camera recording. A message. A call. A witness. A movement. A time step. One fact connecting to the next. Until the blank space surrounding Jady's final hours becomes smaller and smaller. The community around her has already begun mourning. Tributes have described Jady as a valued and loved member of Limerick's diverse community. For the people who knew her personally, though, those descriptions are not newspaper language. They are memories. A conversation. A laugh. A normal day at work. A message they never expected would become one of the last. And that is another reason the answer matters. because behind every developing murder investigation is a group of people waiting for investigators to explain something that currently makes no sense. How someone they knew, someone they expected to see again, could suddenly be gone. For Jady's family, that answer is now separated from them by an ocean. For her friends in Limerick, it is tied to an apartment building they may have passed countless times without ever imagining it would become the center of a murder investigation. And for Gards, it comes down to evidence. There are still major questions that have not been publicly answered. What exactly did the post-mortem reveal? What is the line of inquiry investigators are following? What happened during Jady's final hours? Was anyone seen entering or leaving Carlton House at a significant time? What did surveillance cameras capture? What information have investigators received from residents? And most importantly, who was with Jady or had contact with her before she died? Until those questions are answered, this investigation remains open. And there may still be somebody in Limerick who knows something investigators need. Maybe they saw something. Maybe they heard something. Maybe they noticed someone. Maybe they saw a vehicle near Cecil Street. Maybe they remember something that appeared completely meaningless on Friday morning. But in a murder investigation, context changes everything. The detail you ignored yesterday can become the detail detectives desperately need today. Guards have appealed for anyone with information that could assist the investigation to come forward. Because somewhere between Jady's last normal moment and the moment her friends realized she had not arrived for work is the answer. A woman left Brazil and built a life in Ireland. She made friends. She worked. She created routines. People expected her. People noticed when she was missing. And because they noticed, concern quickly led investigators to her apartment. But they were too late to save her. Now, the same routine that first raised the alarm could help investigators understand her final hours. Who expected Jady that morning? Who knew where she would normally be? Who saw her last? And what happened behind the door of that apartment before the rest of Limerick woke up? Right now, guards know more than they are saying. The post-mortem remains confidential. The line of inquiry remains undisclosed. The investigation remains active. And Jady's family is still waiting. Waiting for answers. Waiting to bring her home. Waiting to understand why a completely ordinary morning ended with detectives inside her apartment. This case began because Jady did not arrive somewhere she was expected to be. And that small absence exposed something much bigger. A woman was dead. A murder investigation had begun. And now, investigators must trace Jady's final hours until they can answer the question at the center of everything. What happened to Jady Cristine Pereira Rosa before she was supposed to leave for work that Friday morning? And who is responsible for taking her life?